Can you actually live a decent life in America on just $1,500 a month in 2026? Not survive. Not sleep in your car. Not eat ramen every night and pray your transmission doesn't die. I mean a real life. A place to live. Food in the fridge. The lights stay on. Gas in the tank. Your phone bill gets paid. And maybe, just maybe, you still have a little money left when the month is over. Sounds impossible? It isn't. Because while people in expensive American cities are watching rent swallow half their paycheck, there are still places where $1,500 a month can cover far more than most people realize. And here's what makes this list especially interesting. Many of these cities aren't just affordable. They're home to some of the deepest Black history, culture, music, and institutions in the country. One city gave the world the Godfather of Soul. One was home to one of Mississippi's most important Black business districts. One has a legendary marching band made it into a Beyoncé film. And one of these cities is so inexpensive that you'll probably stop the video and check the comments because you won't believe the numbers. But here's the catch. Cheap doesn't automatically mean good. Every city on this list has a downside. Some have weaker job markets. Some struggle with crime. Some deal with poverty. Some face hurricanes, flooding, or infrastructure problems. So this isn't a fantasy about cheap places where everything is perfect. It's a much more useful question. Where can $800 a month actually buy you the most life? For this list, we're talking about one person, one monthly budget, rent, utilities, food, phone, gas, the basics. The goal isn't to find the cheapest apartment in America. The goal is to find places where the money left over after housing can still support an actual life. And as we move from number 12 down to number 1, the deals get more interesting. So let's start. Have. Number 12, St. Louis, Missouri. Let's start in the Midwest. On purpose. Because when most people think about affordable American cities with large Black communities, they picture the Deep South. St. Louis breaks that pattern. This is a major American city with a real skyline, professional sports, museums, a legendary food scene, and of course, the Gateway Arch. And yet the cost of living is still low enough to make the coasts look ridiculous. A one-bedroom apartment can land somewhere around the $1,000 mark, and in some neighborhoods, you can still find considerably cheaper options. That's a big deal when your entire monthly budget is $1,800. Because at that point, every $100 matters. But the real reason St. Louis belongs on this list isn't just rent. It's history. The Ville was one of the historic centers of Black life in St. Louis. And right in the middle of that story is Sumner High School, which opened in 1875 and became the first high school west of the Mississippi River to award diplomas to Black students. Think about what that meant at the time. You can walk through the history of a neighborhood that helped produce names like Chuck Berry and Tina Turner. And then there's Annie Malone, the pioneering Black businesswoman who built a major hair care company and became one of the country's earliest Black female millionaires. So St. Louis gives you something unusual. Big city amenities, historic Black culture, and a cost of living that is still relatively low. But there's a reason it's affordable, and you need to know it. St. Louis has long struggled with population loss. Some neighborhoods deal with serious crime, and winters here are not exactly gentle. So this is not a city where you should sign the first cheap lease you find. You have to choose your neighborhood carefully. But if you do your homework, St. Louis can give you something increasingly rare in America. Ask a genuine major city experience without a major city price tag. Have. Number 11, Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia is one of the cities where I want to be especially honest with you. Because this is not the cheapest place on the list. Cost of living is still below the national average, but rents have been moving up. A one-bedroom can land somewhere around $1,000 to $1,200. For one person, $1,500 a month can still work. But for a family with children, things get much tighter. So why is Columbia here? Because affordability isn't just about the rent. It's about what you get for the money. Columbia is home to two historically Black colleges and universities, Benedict College and Allen University. Benedict was founded in 1870, and the story behind its founding is remarkable. A woman from Rhode Island, Bathsheba Benedict, purchased a large former plantation and helped transform that land into an institution of education. A place once associated with bondage became a place of learning. And Columbia has another piece of history that most people would probably drive past without realizing what happened there. The Modjeska Monteith Simpkins House on Marion Street was associated with the work of Thurgood Marshall and NAACP lawyers as they worked on the legal fight that became part of Brown v. Board of Education. Think about that. A normal house, on a normal street, and inside people were helping reshape the country's legal system. That's Columbia. But there's another reason this city matters. It has more of a working economy than many of the cheaper places farther down this list. State government, healthcare, education, and a growing mix of other industries. And that matters. Because sometimes a city that costs you $200 more a month can still be the better financial move if it also gives you better access to jobs. That's the trade-off with Columbia. You give up some affordability, and in return you get more economic opportunity. Have. Number 10, Augusta, Georgia. Say the name Augusta, and one name immediately comes to mind. James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business. A man who started out performing in shining shoes before becoming one of the biggest musical forces in American history. Augusta helped shape him, and the city still carries his legacy. But James Brown isn't the only reason Augusta stands out. The math is pretty attractive too. A one-bedroom apartment can land in the general neighborhood of $1,000. A two-bedroom can still be surprisingly affordable. And housing remains relatively inexpensive compared with much of the country. $1,800 monthly budget. One person can potentially have something very valuable. Breathing room. Not luxury, but breathing room. And Augusta has another deep connection to black education through Payne College, an HBCU founded in the 19th century. Then there's the event that completely changes the city once a year, the Masters. For 1 week, Augusta can feel like a different place. Hotel rooms become expensive. Rental demand explodes. And some locals use that week to rent out their homes and leave town. In some cases, a single week can generate a meaningful amount of income. But Augusta has trade-offs too. Poverty remains a serious issue. Summers can be brutal, and the local economy isn't as diversified as the biggest metropolitan areas. Still, Augusta has something a lot of ultra-cheap cities don't. Combination of affordability and actual economic anchors. Military, cybersecurity, healthcare, and a major annual event that brings money into the city. For someone who wants a lower-cost southern city without giving up every connection to a real working economy, Augusta is a fascinating option. Number 9, Petersburg, Virginia. Now we're moving north. Petersburg is much smaller than most of the cities on this list, around 33,000 people, but its history is massive. The city is heavily black, and one of its most important historic areas is Pocahontas Island, associated with one of the oldest free black communities in the country and the Underground Railroad. People were building lives here long before the laws of America were willing to fully recognize their rights. And just across the river is Virginia State University, an HBCU founded in 1882. One of the school's early leaders, John Mercer Langston, went on to become the first black congressman from Virginia. So yes, there's serious history here. But can the math work? That's where Petersburg becomes especially interesting. Housing remains much more affordable than many parts of Virginia, and the city is only about 23 miles from Richmond. That creates a model that could make sense for the right person. Live in Petersburg. Keep housing costs down. Work in Richmond. Or bring your own income through remote work. That's where a place like Petersburg starts looking really attractive. You don't necessarily need the city you're living in to provide every job. It just needs to give you a reasonable place to live while keeping your expenses under control. But there is a downside. The local job market is relatively thin. And if you're looking for the same range of opportunities you'd find in a major metro, you'll probably have to commute. Still, for someone with remote income or a job in Richmond, Petersburg can be one of those overlooked places that deserves a second look, especially if you like historic homes and older neighborhoods with character. Because sometimes it's better to own something with a story than rent another anonymous beige box. Halfton. Number 8. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. If you've ever watched an HBCU football game and heard the band hit that first note, you already know something about Baton Rouge. This is the home of Southern University, and the Human Jukebox is one of the most recognizable marching bands in the country. The band even appeared in Beyoncé's Homecoming film. But Baton Rouge isn't just about music. It's also part of a much larger historical story. In 1953, Baton Rouge experienced a major bus boycott against segregation. That happened years before the Montgomery bus boycott became nationally famous. And according to the story, Martin Luther King Jr. later reached out to people in Baton Rouge to learn from their experience organizing that campaign. That's an extraordinary piece of history. A local protest helped develop tactics that would become part of the larger civil rights movement. And the city still has that cultural energy today. Southern University, LSU, music, food, tailgates, Louisiana culture everywhere you look. From a cost perspective, Baton Rouge is still relatively affordable. A one-bedroom can average around the $1,000 range. And that gives a single person some room to work with on an $1,500 monthly budget. But Louisiana comes with a warning label: hurricanes, fluting, insurance, and weather that can turn a cheap housing market into a much more complicated financial equation. So if you're thinking about moving here, don't look at rent alone. Look at the full cost of living. Because the cheapest apartment isn't always the cheapest place to live. Number 7, Birmingham, Alabama. Now we're getting into the cities where affordability and history collide in a really powerful way. Birmingham was once home to a massive black business district. The 4th Avenue district had more than 300 black-owned businesses, banks, insurance companies, doctors, lawyers, theaters, entire economic networks built by people who had been shut out of the mainstream economy. So what did they do? They built their own. That history sits right beside the Birmingham Civil Rights District, 16th Street Baptist Church, Kelly Ingram Park, places that became symbols of one of the most important struggles in modern American history. But Birmingham isn't just a museum. It's also a city where affordability still matters. The cost of living is below the national average. One-bedroom apartments can often be found around the $1,000 range or lower, depending on the neighborhood. And for one person with $1,500 a month, that can create a surprisingly comfortable budget. There's another reason Birmingham stands out: healthcare. The city has major medical and university institutions, creating a stronger employment base than some of the smaller and cheaper towns on this list. And that's important, because low housing costs mean a lot less if there isn't a decent way to earn a living. But Birmingham has a huge caveat. This is a neighborhood-by-neighborhood city. Some areas are thriving, some are struggling, and the difference between them can be surprisingly small geographically. Don't research Birmingham as one giant market. Research the exact neighborhood, the exact street, the exact commute. That's how you separate a bargain from a bad decision. Have. Number 6. Macon, Georgia. Macon is one of those American cities where the history of music is much bigger than the city's reputation today. Little Richard was born here. Otis Redding grew up here. And Redding's early story is almost unbelievable. He became such a dominant performer in local talent competitions that he was eventually banned from competing so someone else could actually win the prize money. That's how good he was. Macon still carries that musical DNA. And then there's the other side of the story: affordability. A studio can be relatively inexpensive. One-bedroom apartments can stay around the $1,000 range. And depending on the source and the neighborhood, the city's overall cost of living can be significantly below the national average. That means $1,700 can go a long way here for one person, but Macon comes with one major qualification. It makes more sense if you already have income. Remote worker. Excellent. Rhetoric? Potentially excellent. Someone with stable outside income? Very attractive. Someone depending completely on a strong local labor market? Much less attractive. Macon isn't Atlanta, and that's the whole point. You can live close enough to reach Atlanta when you need a major airport, a big concert, or a major city experience. Then go back to a much cheaper place to actually live. It's a pretty compelling trade. Have. Number 5, Montgomery, Alabama. Now we're getting into the heavyweights. Because Montgomery isn't just another affordable southern city. This is one of the places where the history of the civil rights movement is practically under your feet. December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks is arrested after refusing to give up her seat on a city bus. A few days later, the Montgomery bus boycott begins. It lasts more than a year. And at the center of it is a 26-year-old pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. Think about how young he was, and think about what happened next. That local movement helped change the direction of the country. Today, Montgomery is also home to Alabama State University, an HBCU founded in 1867. And here's the financial part. Housing remains relatively affordable. Median rent is much lower than what you'd expect in major American cities. Home prices remain accessible compared with national standards, and overall cost of living is below average. For one person with $1,500 a month, the math can work without the constant pressure you'd feel in a much more expensive city. But Montgomery has problems too. Poverty, hot and humid summers, a modest local economy. So again, this isn't about pretending the city has no issues. It's about understanding the trade. For a person who values affordability, history, and access to government or military employment, Montgomery becomes much more interesting. And there's something else you get for free. Almost every corner has a story. Number 4, Prairie View, Texas. This might be the most surprising city on the entire list, because Prairie View isn't really a city in the way most people imagine one. It's tiny, under 9,000 people, but it has something enormous. Prairie View A&M University, one of the oldest public HBCUs in Texas, founded in 1876. And the history here is almost impossible to ignore. The university sits on land that was once a working plantation. A place once associated with slavery became a place where generations of black students could get an education and build careers. From plantation land, to higher education, to military leadership and professional success. That transformation is the story. And then there are the numbers. A one-bedroom can land around the $900 range. For a single person with $1,500 a month, that's a very different financial equation from living in Houston. But there is a trade. Prairie View is small. A car is basically essential. Houston is roughly an hour away. And if you need a huge local job market, this isn't your place. There's another issue you should know about. Students at Prairie View have spent decades fighting for voting rights and dealing with disputes involving Waller County. So this is not just a cute, cheap college town. It's a community with a complicated history and a strong sense of identity. And when you move here, you're not just moving into an inexpensive apartment. You're stepping into one of the country's quieter examples of historical transformation. Number 3, Shreveport, Louisiana. Now we reach the part of the list where the housing numbers start to sound almost unreal. Some rent trackers put Shreveport's median rent below $900. Some place it even lower. And overall cost of living is among the lowest on this countdown. So here's what happens when your monthly budget is $1,500. In an expensive city, $1,500 might barely cover housing. In Shreveport, it can cover a much larger portion of your entire life. Rent, have food, gas, bills, and potentially money left over. That's a huge difference, because affordability isn't only about having a cheap place to live. It's about how much money you have left after the essentials are paid. And Shreveport can perform surprisingly well on that test. But let's be honest about the reason. The city has been losing population. Poverty is high. The job market is not especially strong. And severe weather is part of life in this region. So the question becomes, who does Shreveport work for? For a remote worker? Have. Very interesting. For a retiree with stable income? Very interesting. For someone bringing their own paycheck into the city? Potentially excellent. For someone who needs the city itself to produce a huge number of high-paying jobs? Much less compelling. And that's one of the biggest lessons in this entire video. Sometimes the best place to live cheaply isn't the place with the best economy. It's the place where asterisk your existing income stretches the farthest. Have. Number 2, Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis could easily be number 1 on a different list, because when you combine affordability, culture, music, and history, this city is incredibly hard to beat. Memphis is about 63% black. And this isn't just a city that participated in American music. It helped define it. Beale Street, the Blues, Stax Records, Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, Booker T, and the MGs. A huge part of the sound of 20th century America passed through this city, and you can still walk through that history. The Stax Museum preserves the story. And then there's the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel, a place associated with one of the most tragic and important moments in American history. So Memphis gives you two enormous cultural stories at once: music and civil rights. And somehow, the housing market is still relatively affordable. A one-bedroom can fall somewhere in the $900 to $1,100 range. That leaves meaningful room in an $1,500 monthly budget. But once again, there is a big warning: crime. Memphis has real crime problems. And, like Birmingham, it's a neighborhood-by-neighborhood city. One part of town can feel completely different from another. So this isn't a place where you should blindly choose the cheapest zip code you find. Research the neighborhood. Research the block. Research the commute. Do that, and Memphis becomes one of the most compelling value propositions in America. Because where else can you get this much music, history, food, and culture without paying coastal city prices? And yes, the barbecue matters too. Have. Number 1. Jackson, Mississippi. Now we've reached number 1. And I want to be very clear about why Jackson is here. Not because it's perfect. It's not. Not because it has the strongest economy. It doesn't. And not because every neighborhood is equally safe or attractive. They're not. Jackson is number 1 because of the specific question we asked at the beginning. Where can $1,800 a month buy you the most complete life while also putting you inside a deeply rooted black community? Jackson makes a very strong case. The city is about 7% black. That's an extraordinary concentration. This isn't a city where the black community is some small cultural pocket. It is central to the identity of the city itself. And then you look at the cost. A one-bedroom can come in under the roughly $900 range. A two-bedroom can be around $1,100. And overall living costs remain well below what people in the country's biggest cities are used to, which means $1,500 can actually function as a full monthly living budget. Not just rent, a full budget. And then there's the history. Farish Street, once one of the most important economically independent black communities in Mississippi. Trumpet Records. The Big Apple Inn, Medgar Evers. Jackson State University. This is a city where black history isn't a side attraction. It is woven into the structure of the place. But now comes the part I don't want you to ignore. Jackson has a poverty rate in the mid-20s. The local job market is weaker than many larger cities. And the city has struggled with serious water system problems that have made national headlines. That's the other side of the low price. A low cost of living doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is usually a reason. So who might Jackson make sense for? A remote worker, a retiree, someone with stable outside income, someone who can bring their paycheck with them instead of depending entirely on the local economy. For that person, the equation changes dramatically. You bring the money in, you keep your expenses low, and you create something increasingly difficult to find in America. Asterisk room to breathe. That's why Jackson takes the number 1 spot. Not because it is perfect, because it gives you an unusually powerful combination of affordability, black culture, history, and relatively low living costs. Have. So what did we actually learn? 12 cities. 12 very different stories. But look closely and you'll notice a pattern. Many of these places were built by communities that had to create their own economic and cultural institutions, their own businesses, their own schools, their own churches, their own neighborhoods, their own music, their own political movements. And in many cases, those same communities are still shaping the cities today. So the question isn't really, Asterisk, what's the cheapest city in America? That's too simple. The better question is, where does your money have the most purchasing power? Because $1,800 in San Francisco is one story. $1,500 in Memphis is another. $1,800 in Shreveport is another. And $1,500 in Jackson is something else entirely. The cheapest rent doesn't always mean the best deal. A city with better jobs can be worth paying a little more for. A city with worse infrastructure may be cheap for a reason. A city with a low housing cost can become expensive once you add insurance, transportation, or other hidden costs. That's why you never move based on one number. Look at the neighborhood. Look at the job market. Look at transportation. Look at insurance. Look at healthcare. Look at infrastructure. And most importantly, look at what's left after every bill is paid. Because that's the number that actually tells you whether you can breathe. And maybe that's the most important idea in this entire video. America hasn't suddenly become cheap, but America is much bigger than the cities everyone talks about. There are still places where your income can buy more. Places with deep history. Places with strong communities. Places where a person with a modest monthly budget isn't automatically locked out of having a decent life. So now I want to hear from you. If you had exactly $800 a month to cover your life, which of these 12 cities would you choose? St. Louis? Augusta? Birmingham? Memphis? Shreveport? Or Jackson? Drop your pick in the comments. Because the city that gets the most attention may be the one we break down next. And you might discover something even more interesting than a cheap place to live. You might discover a place where your money finally works as hard as you do.